The poor needed somebody to represent them. And now, do we care about the poor? Do we hear about the poor from Obama? No. Do we hear about the poor from Romney? No. Do we hear about the poor from most of our politicians? No.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just want to say that I'm grateful to Ms. Alma Brown and the city of Peoria for extending this invitation to me to come here today and to share with you what I think about Martin Luther King Jr., racial politics, American culture, and the society in which we live. It's a tremendous honor. I've written 2 books on Dr. King and have been awarded for those books, but the greatest reward has been the kind attention and the incredible detail that has been paid to those books, and then people being able to read and engage them. Broader than that, I'm honored to be in a long legacy of strong speakers who have come to this city to be able to engage in a vibrant fashion the most central ideals and tenets of a man's life, who now rises in a memorial and a monument on the National Mall. So with that said, I'll be open for questions.
You know, one of your books is talking about the changes and the influence that Dr. King said had on America. What are some of the impact that that is going to cause for America?
Well, Dr. King's death, of course, was quite traumatic collectively for African American people and indeed American society. 1968, 39 years old. The Housing Act was passed in the aftermath of his death. President Johnson pushed that legislation through in honor of Dr. King. We'd already had the Civil Rights Act. We'd already had the Voting Rights Act. And in 1968, the Fair Housing Act, which really was the last pillar of official apartheid in the South and in America, was in a sense knocked out. So Dr. King's death had an immediate impact in terms of legislation, but it also had a broader impact. It marked a before King, after King moment. The vicious apartheid of America was exposed for what it was, the real hatred of this man for wanting to do nothing more than transform American society and make it reflect the ideals of democracy for which he had committed, to which he had committed his life. It also changed how we perceived race in America, and a lot of more things got done. There's a recent book published, for instance, that talks about the class of Clarence Thomas at I think it's Holy Cross. And it was not just Clarence Thomas. The priest there, in the aftermath of King's death, said he's so upset he wanted to go out and do something important about American apartheid, and recruited Clarence Thomas. Some might not see that as a good thing, but he certainly has made a contribution in the legal profession. I happen to disagree with most of his ideas, but I celebrate the fact that we can bring all sorts of people into the process and to educate young men and women of all colors and stripes. Edward Jones, the great novelist, was in that class as well. So that's one immediate impact. More broadly, Dr. King's death forced us to come to grips with the need and necessity of having a systematic attempt to bring racial and radical democracy to bear upon America, not only in terms of housing, but in terms of education, a more aggressive pursuit of affirmative action, and what that might mean for America. Intellectually and spiritually, he became an iconic figure, but let's not forget he was very unpopular at the time of his death. But his death was a kind of sweet martyrdom that swept away all of the contradictions and conflicts. So now we've seized upon King's image and iconic status as a reminder of the work we yet have to do.
As a drum major of justice today, what do you see as being one of the biggest challenges facing African Americans?
Well, I think obviously economic inequality is huge. Poverty in our numbers has swollen to unacceptable ranks. It's always unacceptable for human beings not to have the basic needs in life. But if you'll remember, Dr. King spent the last years of his life fighting against poverty, what he called militarism, and the triplets: militarism, poverty, and racism. And he certainly wanted the reality of poor people brought to bear in the larger society. I would say the persistence of poverty, the unacceptably high unemployment rate of African American people, above 17%, which means it's probably closer to 20. Those kind of issues are serious, but poverty, the working poor, people who get up every day of their lives and work and can't make ends meet, that's a kind of issue that King would fight against. He would also fight against the blight of the lower working class, the middle class. We talk about Occupy Wall Street and the like. Dr. King led a movement that, had he lived, would have gone to Washington, D.C. to occupy that city. They did, in his death, in the aftermath of his death, do so for about a couple of months in Resurrection City. But that was an idea that he, along with many others, came up with to say, these are people who are poor, they have no jobs, let's bring them to Washington, D.C. to dramatize their plight and predicament.
Being known as the hip-hop professor, how can we use the love, the legacy of Martin Luther King to teach young people when it comes to hip-hop how to love each other and how to value life in Peoria?
Yes, sir. Well, that's very important. In Peoria in particular, obviously you need to find talented young people who may not have access to the higher levels of formal education, who may not be convinced that they are worthy of being paid attention to. When you've got disproportionate money concentrated in suburban schools versus what happens in the inner city, it says to us that we have a priority on those who live outside the city versus those who live within, and that's across America. I think that using hip-hop as a method and a vehicle to expose some of the important and salient issues in life is very important. When you look at, the Watch the Throne concert with Jay-Z and Kanye, yeah, there's a bunch of luxury rap and cars talked about, but they're also talking about the persistence of racism, the radical inegalitarian principles that, misdistribute and maldistribute wealth, that kind of stuff. You talk about fatherlessness and father absence. Jay-Z said, now all my teachers couldn't reach me and my father couldn't beat me. Mama couldn't beat me hard enough to match the pain of my pop not seeing me. So with that disdain in my membrane, got on my pimp game, blanked the world, my defense came. Oh, so in that lyric is contained a sociological analysis of the forces of suffering when father absence is available. Let's talk to young people about that. Let's talk to them about what can happen when they determine to become excellent at something. Because here are young people often growing up in poverty who are rappers who become well-known and well-paid. Why? Because they're excellent at what they do. Let's talk about an ethic of excellence and how that can transform our lives, but also the self-love that's necessary. Let's deal with kind of the self-hatred. Why can't we recognize another human being? Why is it that we feel a certain kind of hostility and antipathy for somebody who looks just like us? Yes, cues in the larger society give us a hint that that life may not be significant because my life is not significant. So in Peoria, ministers and imams and nurses and lawyers and doctors and the middle class and the political elites must pay attention to the most vulnerable so that they can be integrated into the larger circle of American, and in this case, Peoria privilege.
Dr. Dyson, along those lines, who are the figures living today in this century that are really continuing to live Dr. King's legacy, not just quoting him, not just citing him, but really delivering that message to you?
Well, the proliferation of leadership across the country, you got so many local leaders who are doing great things. You've got people who are social activists who are doing great things. I happen to think Occupy Wall Street is a perfect example of people being fed up and saying, what are we going to do to take our government back? That would be one example. Susan Taylor, the former editor of Essence magazine, who is now head of the National Cares Movement. Here's a woman who's wealthy and well-to-do and could have retired. But what she did instead was to try to jumpstart a movement to mentor young black men and women across America, because without mentorship, they don't get a sense of what's possible in life and how they can achieve at higher levels. These are just two examples. Congresswoman Barbara Lee, Congresswoman Maxine Waters. I think about the extraordinary leadership of Barack Obama in embodying in a certain way some of the elements of Martin Luther King Jr., but as a political figure, he's going to also undercut some of those elements as well. So when we look at people across the board, high political figures, very visible people, local social activists and political activists who are trying to resist and resist economic oppression, resist racial oppression, extended into sexual orientation issues. I think when we talk about King's legacy, let's talk about those who are activists on behalf of the gay and lesbian, transgender and bisexual communities. Let's look at hip-hop culture and the way in which young people are listening to lyrics that used to be expressed in pulpits across America. Those people, I think, are extending King's legacy. Teachers who do their best to make certain that their children and their students are reached, and that the resources out of their own pockets sometimes reach those kids in order to encourage them. So many people are continuing that legacy and extending the trajectory of justice for which Dr. King died.
Do you think that Dr. King would be satisfied with the way that American culture is today? Is this what he envisioned?
Well, absolutely not. I mean, in one sense, of course, there's been undeniable progress, extraordinary opportunity for African American people, for Latinos, to a certain degree, Asian brothers and sisters, First Nation people have not made as radical a leap forward. But across the board, there's been undeniable progress. But there's a lot of work that remains to be done. When you think about the fact I've mentioned the high unemployment rate, that's unacceptable. That 17.6%, perhaps even higher, of African American people are unemployed. That Latinos are unemployed to the degree that they are. The health care debacle, some people call it debacle, really. You know, people are not receiving health care. You know, I would suggest that perhaps some of those senators and Congress people who are so upset with, quote, Obamacare, would say, let's be equal then. Let's have the same kind of health insurance you have and call it a day. Now, if you have it, but you don't want somebody else to have it, you're obviously engaging in a lot of political speak that has nothing to do with reality. Either it's good and fair. If we subject politicians, whom I support in certain varieties, of course, because they're extremely critical to the provenance of democracy in our existence and the legislation that is necessary to reflect our ideals, if we say to politicians, live by the principles that you want to impose on others, we'd have a different looking kind of government, and we'd be a lot more fair. A lot of people don't have access to health care. They use it at what? They use the emergency room as medical care. And if you use the emergency room as medical care, by the time you get to the emergency room and the problem shows up, you're already in serious trouble. So when we talk about health care, King would be deeply disappointed. He would be disappointed in the constant preoccupation with war and violence that prevail across the world. So these are some of the issues that King would speak about. The poverty that I've already spoken about would be persistent in his vision. What do we do? How do we respond? How do we galvanize the government? Activate politicians, local activists, to make certain that the conditions of our society are somehow altered and changed.